Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to CPA Academy. My name is Chris Downey and I'm your webinar moderator for today. Today's webinar is titled Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One Unanswered Questions. Today's presenter is none other than Jina Etienne. Before we get started, please go to your questions panel and pull that out and let me know where you are on planet Earth, where you're listening to us from, and that you can see both of us and see her first slide. And I'm seeing Puerto Rico, I'm seeing New Mexico. Hello and welcome to everyone. Also, if you have questions, put them in the panel as well, or if there are any technical issues, ask them there and I will answer them as soon as I possibly can. And now that we know that everything is working, one other piece of housekeeping. Today's webinar qualifies for 1 hour of CPE credit. And the way you will earn that hour is stick around with us for 50 minutes of the entire allotted time and answer 3 of the 4 polling questions that will be launched. Your CPE will be issued within 24 hours of this class and will be in your accounts also. There are also handout materials that you can also download and watch for your own leisure later. And with no further ado, please help me in welcoming Jina Etienne. Thank you.
Wow, I'm over here trying to get my life organized because, technology, and I have a million things happening. Hello, everyone. And thank you for joining me on another episode, if you will, episodes of D&I One-on-One. I'm Jina Etienne, and I'm the host of this series. So if you've been attending them, you see me here every other Friday, usually talking with another guest. But I don't usually talk about what I do. I'm actually a D&I consultant with a full-time, all I've ever worked in career is in accounting, most of the time in public accounting. And today I'm a D&I consultant. And my practice focuses on culture. I do training, workshops, conferences, keynotes. And I also do consulting where I function almost as an outsourced or virtual chief diversity officer or CDO, because most of my clients are small to medium-sized firms. And they can't afford or have the budget or for the resources for a full-time chief diversity officer. So this is what I do for a living. And I'm really excited about the series because it gives me an opportunity to talk with other professionals, my colleagues, and then anyone with a different perspective or background or insight as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And the goal of the series is to really bring a topic, one conversation, rather than this being a presentation. It's really, can we talk about just one thing and nuances of that thing as it relates to diversity and inclusion? The series launched in February of 2021, and it's been running every other Friday since then, with the exception of the holidays. Tend to skip a date or two here. And there have been a lot of questions that have been submitted over now the year and some that I've been doing this, and we've not been able to get to all of the questions. Some folks have reached out through email and on LinkedIn. I've even had somebody reach out to me on Twitter, which is fantastic, and ask some follow-up questions. But never, you can't answer them all. And so what I'm trying to do in today's session is I went back through all of the Q&A. And in the registration, there was also a link where people could go in and drop in a new question. And I wanted to see what kept coming up as themes over and over again, and then maybe dig a little bit more into those topics. I'm going to invite you to ask questions as we go along. I actually have the Q&A open in front of me. And so this whole session is really intended to be an open dialogue. There are a lot of slides in this deck. If you've already downloaded it, you'll see. And there are way more slides in here than we can cover. And the reason I did that is I pulled some content from presentations I've done, from training sessions I've created, just to give you more content, maybe to use this very deck as a resource if it's helpful. And so with that, what I want to do is I'm going to just start walking through these slides, these questions, and try to get through them. Well, I'll get through all of the ones I've positioned that I've included in the deck, and then we'll go from there. All right, the first question. Now, this one dates back to the program I did back in February. It was the second one I ever did. I did this with Julius Green, and it was titled Leading the Charge. this question specifically came from there, but I have seen iterations of this question. At least every other session, some version of this. So the question specifically is, I'm a minority. Let me read it off the slide, actually. I'm a minority and a partner in a small firm, about 100 staff, and I'm having difficulty getting my partners to invest in D&I. Any suggestions? So I get this a lot in my work. And a lot of people understand that D&I feels like it's the right thing to do, but it doesn't always connect with the business imperative. There's not necessarily a link between it being something to do because, we want to make our people feel comfortable, or it's the trend. We want to make sure we're keeping up with what other organizations are doing, or we don't want to be perceived as not doing it. But is there more? Is there a way to convince leadership to do this, not because it's the right thing to do, but it's a really smart thing to do for business? So back in, this says January 2015, it was updated in 2018. They've since come out with a couple of other reports, one of which focuses on inclusion. But this is a report that McKinsey came out, and to me, it was a game changer, because after this report was when I started to hear people really talk about the business case of diversity and inclusion in a more meaningful way. Essentially, what this report came out and said is that there is a correlation, not causation. There's a correlation between diversity, ethnic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, and performance. And so organizations that were more diverse performed better. There are a lot of different ways they broke this down. So for example, in an executive leadership team, when you have 22% to be exact, when you have 22% or more women represented in that leadership team, that seemed to be the tipping point for when the organization ended up being more, they didn't say profitable, I'll say better performance. But overall, racial and ethnic diversity also tipped the scale in that direction. So I think one of the first things you can do with your partners is to talk about it from this perspective. Talk about diversity in terms of the business case, not in terms of it being the so-called right thing to do. Now, there's this wonderful tool. It's available on SHRM's website. SHRM is formerly known as the Society for Human Resource Management. And there's this self-assessment that they have to help with developing your business case. Now, what I've done here is I've highlighted in blue what the focus areas of these all are. But what I want you to notice is that they all tie back to the key business objectives. And that's the trick. You can't convince somebody to do diversity and inclusion work to make people feel better, at least not leaders. The goal of the organization is to be profitable, to grow, and to make money. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what businesses do. So if we're going to try to convince our business partners and other executive leadership to do this work, it has to tie back. And so looking at these questions, it's really understanding who are the stakeholders that are invested in D&I. How does your business need to change in order to meet your key objectives? And then what do those changes mean in the context of diversity and inclusion? So are there changes you need to make in your workplace? Are there changes in different ways? Think marketplace segmentation, for example, that diversity can support. So thinking about that, and only you can know the answer to these questions in the context of your business, because attendees here could be from industry, public accounting. They're not necessary. They could be in bookkeeping and tax preparation services, tax advisory services, consulting services, you name it, across the board. But what I'm sharing here is universally true for any organization. So I see here a comment that says, diversity is happier overall employees and a wider market to sell to. And I think that's really important because the demographic shifts, and in fact, I promise that comment wasn't planted. Let me move forward here a couple of slides. So this slide is here just to see the composition of the employee workforce. The biggest bubble is green. Those are millennials. And the interesting thing about this trend is the demographics in terms of age of the workforce is starting to shift because boomers are retiring at a faster rate than expected. And as a result, proportionally, millennials are becoming the largest segment of the workforce. And depending on what article you read, they're projected to be as high as 75% of the workforce in 2030, although I'm not sure I agree with that. But this is the slide I wanted to share. The overall demographics in this country are changing. And it's not just it's simple. It is declining birth rates for different groups. It is overall population declines, as well as migration patterns globally. And so diversity is important to understand. In that previous comment around selling to wider markets, you might start to see segmentation, product differentiation, new product, new service lines, new clients, new industry opportunities organized around different dimensions of diversity. And so that's why another way to approach the business case. Let's see. This slide really speaks to a Deloitte report. I would encourage you to look at that. It walks through what are called the 8 truths, or is it the 8 myths of diversity and inclusion? And this is really another example of what you can bring to your partners and your fellow leaders, which is just the numbers, the data. Forget doing diversity because it feels good. How about look at all the way on the right here. Organizations with inclusive cultures are 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So, hey, partners, let's work on inclusion because it will improve our business results. And then the last slide here, and then we're going to go to our first polling question. The last slide here is this report that came out by BetterUp. I believe it came out last year or the year before. They surveyed about, let's see. So I don't have the exact numbers here, but basically they went out and they did a survey to try to assess loneliness and a sense of purpose and connection to work. They asked people if they felt like they belonged, and then they also asked a series of other questions. And what you see here are some very interesting findings. People who reported a sense of belonging. Take number 3, reported 75% fewer sick days. Sick days are real dollars in your partner's pocket, if you're an executive leader or a business owner. And so trying to create a space that is inclusive, where people feel like they belong, will actually save real dollars in the form of reduced turnover, fewer sick days, and potentially improved recruiting opportunities. All right, so Chris, it's time for our first polling question. Let's go ahead and get that one launched.
All right, folks, your first polling question for the day, and this is 1 out of 4. Has your organization developed a D&I business case that's directly tied to key business objectives? Answer A is yes, B is no, C not sure, or D prefer not to answer. And this will remain on your screen for approximately 60 seconds. Make your selections now.
While they're taking the poll, I want to acknowledge a comment that came in the Q&A. Quote, just want to say, as someone with auditory processing disorder, I appreciate the closed captions. I've never seen that on a CPA Academy course before. Anyone who's doing a PowerPoint presentation, I want you to know that if you put it in presentation speaker view, there is an option to turn on closed captioning, and the view will look like what you see here. And I would encourage everyone to consider doing that on every presentation. And I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to that question.
I think that's awesome. I'm going to close the poll out, folks, in 3, 2, and 1. And Jina, hear your results as well.
So have you developed a business case tied to business objectives? I see 37% yes, 22% no, and 34% not sure. And so I would say to the 22 and 34%, think if there's a takeaway here in the session that maybe you can bring it back to your organization. Thank you, Chris. All right, so 2 other slides here. I'm not going to walk through them in detail, but I want you to see that there's an article that Julia shared in this session. And I have the title here. You can look at it more closely on the PowerPoint when you download the slides. But it walks through these 6 steps. And it might provide some additional insight in terms of how to get leadership to get more engaged. All right, so the next question. This is from Disability Inclusion, and this was part of what inspired me to figure out the closed caption thing, by the way. Disability, my firm's D&I efforts are only focused on race and gender as in men and women. They aren't comfortable with LGBTQ plus and disability and inclusion. Any suggestions? So in terms of suggestions, let's see, just looking at comments. I want to stay on top of the Q&A. So in terms of suggestions, first of all, let's make the language less threatening, because one of the areas I've learned from clients that they're least comfortable talking about is disability, then LGBTQ plus entities. And a lot of the reason that there's discomfort is because, one, we don't know the language, but two, we don't understand it. There are a lot of myths around disability. There are a lot of misunderstandings and anxieties around the gay and lesbian community. And I say gay and lesbian community to make it simpler than saying LGBTQ plus. But know that I'm almost using those terms interchangeably, even though they aren't interchangeable. All of that because I don't want somebody to be offended at the choices of words that I'm using. But I think it's important from a disability perspective that we understand what it means so we can take some of the stigma out of it. Because when we can talk about it as a matter of fact, then it makes it more comfortable, more approachable. And then we can, after we explore it and talk about it, understand how to get it incorporated into D&I efforts. So last April, I think it was the session on April 16th, I had Andy Imparato. He's the executive director of Disability Rights California. And he joined me on a session called Disability Inclusion. So this is a copy of a slide from his presentation. And it really is talking about why including disabilities in the D&I conversation is so important. So this goes back to that question, how do we get LGBTQ plus and disability identities incorporated in the D&I conversation? And so it's really similar to the business case. It's coming back to the why, being able to address, why this is so important. How does this impact our employees that work in our organization day to day? Or if I'm a manager, the employees on my team that I lead. Are there barriers that if we take them down, that they can open up the opportunities for people to thrive in the organization, and we can actually see enhanced performance? And by understanding the different identities and all of the differences that we're trying to see, respect, and value, we can create a workspace that first set of data points from the McKinsey study that show that when we can leverage this diversity, our organization can actually perform better. But we have to recognize that diversity includes disabilities. Now, Andy shared this article, 5 Reasons Why Disability Issues Should Be a Higher Priority Even Now. That was actually from January 2021, as you can see here. It's a Forbes article. The only caveat to this article is that if you look at the bottom of the list, government, disability policy, disabled voters, those are principles that can be useful. I'm not sharing this because of the political, there's some references in there that are politics, but the first and the second points are so important to understand. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I'm going to say something like 3 out of 4 people will experience a disability in their lifetime, increasingly so as we age. And over 70% of disabilities are invisible. And as a result of that, you have people who have disabilities that cover the entire spectrum of every other aspect of diversity. So whether we're looking at diversity in terms of race, gender identity, age, parental status, ethnic background, language, different levels of experience, roles. There are so many dimensions of diversity that do get discussed in D&I work. Cutting across all of those is disability. And so that's one opportunity then to help people understand the importance of disability inclusion being part of the conversation, because it is something that is universal to all other dimensions of diversity. And there's a high crossover between the two. 70% of the people with a disability, we won't even know they have one if they don't self-report it. And because of the stigma around disability, a lot of people don't want to self-report it. And so if we just look at disability and address some of those challenges in our D&I efforts, we'd actually be helping so many of our employees statistically. There are employees in the organization that will have a disability they won't know about. So this is the kind of falls into the win-win category. You can help one group that can help many groups at the same time. This next question, and there were several questions over the course of this series that fall into this genre. So this actually came from, I'm ahead of myself. This question came from the session we did back in February with Alonzo Alexander. He is the Chief Ethics and Diversity Officer at the National Association of the State Boards of Accountancy, fondly known as NASBA. He's the president for NASBA's Center for the Public Trust, and he's also CEO of his own D&I consulting practice. And so the question is this: we're establishing our first employee resource group. Any important factors for us to consider, success tips, if you will. And so employee resource groups are generally considered volunteer groups inside of organizations organized around a particular dimension of diversity. So they provide networking, support, resources, education, mentoring. They give people opportunities to meet others across their organization that share a common attribute. So they might normally be organized around things like race, gender identity, LGBTQ, for example, identities. Maybe somebody who's veteran, caregivers. It could be boomers and millennials. They can be organized around any dimension of diversity. The idea about what that group does is it focuses its priorities on that group. So if it's a veterans organization, employee resource group, maybe then they might talk about issues that are unique to veterans. Maybe it's just networking opportunities to meet other veterans in the organization. Maybe it's a way to create mentoring opportunities for veterans or veterans mentoring others to create commonality of understanding and increased cultural awareness. So a lot of organizations are launching employee resource groups. And so a couple of things to think about then, as you've seen here on the slide, you want to make sure there's enough interest. You want to make sure very clear goals and objectives are established so that it doesn't end up just being a club or a clique or something like that. You're going to need buy-in and support from leadership so that they allow people to take the time to participate in these activities, and they provide resources to hold those activities, whether they're internal conferences or they're networking events, bringing in outside speakers, things like that. And then organizations will need to recruit members. And when you recruit members, let's say it is an LGBTQ plus business resource group. You also need people to join that group who are cisgender. We'll talk about that term in a moment. But you need the straight white guy, the straight black woman to be an ally of the LGBTQ plus BRG, business resource group or employee resource group. And so you want to think about how can you recruit members. Now, not all organizations can afford this. That person asking the question said they were forming one, but for some, an alternative might be to look at external affinity groups. Now, affinity groups and employee resource groups in some organizations are interchangeable terms. I'm using them in the context of this program. Employee resource group is an internal organization. Affinity groups are an external organization. Just making the distinction here, just know that terminology, it tends to vary. But the point here is that if your organization can't justify the spend around employee resource groups, or your organization just isn't big enough, you have 100 people, Well, you can only support but so many employee resource groups before everything becomes an all company thing. So perhaps looking at some outside organizations like National Association of Black Accountants, the National Society of Black CPAs. I say that one, and to be transparent, I'm chair on the board of that one, so I felt obligated to share it. There's ALPHA, the Association of Latin Professionals for America. There is Ascend, which is a group that's focused on Pan-Asian accountants. There are a lot of different organizations that are available to invite your staff to participate in, support them in terms of membership dues, support them in terms of giving them time off to attend conferences, events, host and sponsor programs for local chapters of those organizations. It can provide your members and your teammates similar experiences, networks, support, education, and resources that you might not be able to do in an internal employee resource group. All right. Before we move to the next set of questions, Chris, next polling question.
Awesome. Polling question number 2. Does your organization have employee resource groups? Yes, no, not sure, or you prefer not to answer. This poll will remain up for 60 seconds, and please make your selections now for your CPE.
I saw a comment earlier, Chris, that somebody said they chose prefer not to answer as the equivalent of a not applicable. I think that option is there just for people who have to answer the question because they're here for CPE. But I take it as an NA as well.
Indeed.
We have about 20 seconds left. Somebody put in a comment here that when the economy takes a downturn, these programs will suffer. I think it's interesting. I think that's going to be, and it depends. Like any other question in the world of accounting, you ask the question and the first thing you could say is, well, it depends. And I think that it depends in this case because on the one hand, dedicated resources is actually less expensive than supporting employees going through a lot of different places. The flip side is also true, but I appreciate the point.
And I'll close the poll down here now in 3, 2, and 1. And as you know, these are your results. So a whopping 49% have said yes.
Right, 24% no, 23% not sure. So for the 24 and the 23%, this is an opportunity to inquire with your employer. Even if you don't have one, as I shared here, might there be opportunities to still engage with the network that can help you or help you connect with different areas of your identity that maybe don't feel seen as much in the workplace.
All right.
All right, so a couple of questions. Sorry, go ahead.
Back to you.
Sorry, thank you. So there were a couple of questions. So this session was Sasha Thompson back in last October. She's founder of an organization called the Equity Equation. She's another diversity coaching and consulting firm. And by the way, she has a new, I think it's a podcast called DEI After 5. You can look it up if you're interested. It's a great podcast. So there were several questions that came up out of her session, and I improvised, I think, actually all of these questions came directly out of Q&A, but from a series of different sessions relating to identities. So the first one is, why are we asking people to identify as cis men or women? And is it offensive to say, I am a woman? And at the end of the day, it's important to understand that we don't want to be offensive, but we do want to understand the terminology. So if we're being asked to identify, it's just because we don't want to assume. We've asked a lot of people over the years to cover up their differences, to assimilate into the group by downplaying what makes them different or hiding it altogether, either for their own safety or for our discomfort, whatever the case may be. And so one of the conversations that's starting to change is a recognition that gender is a lot more fluid and a lot more, it is something that we can talk about and not necessarily make assumptions around. So understanding that, you see the term here, gender literacy, is very helpful so that we know I can say woman and I'm not offending anyone because it's my identity. How can I offend you by telling you how I identify? The flip is also true for somebody who's non-binary, that they shouldn't offend me by telling me how they identify. So, when it comes to this stuff, it gets a little complicated. I did want to include the definition of the term cisgender, and it describes somebody whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth, often abbreviated as cis. So I'm a cis male, I'm a cis female, I'm a cis woman. That's what that means. The next question that came up in that series was, what does it mean if somebody identifies as non-binary? So again, another definition then. Non-binary is a spectrum of gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or exclusively feminine. Identities that are outside the gender binary of male and female. Now, this can be a little bit confusing for some because we live in a society, and there are other societies, but not all, that have a social construct based around men and women as being the only two genders. And it's actually a lot more fluid. It's a lot more complicated. The opening part of this quote, all humans are born with biological characteristics of sex, either male, female, or intersex. And I thought that was important to share because human anatomy isn't as clear cut as we think. Ask doctors, they will tell you. This is not intended to be a course on anatomy. That will be very uncomfortable for me. But what's important to understand is that when we talk about gender, it is not an A-B switch. It is not on and off. It is not black and white. It is not just male or female. There are a number of identities, and you can see the spectrum here below. Cisgender, agender, androgynous, gender fluid, intersex, gender queer, gender questioning. There are a lot of terms, and understanding that language will help us feel comfortable. This goes back to that first question about LGBTQ plus not being included in D&I efforts. So they asked about LGBTQ plus and disability. And I held off on the LGBTQ plus conversation because I knew we were going to get to it here. So what about some additional definitions? When I say LGBTQ plus, what do I mean? And do you have to have the plus? What about I at the end? There's IA. There are a lot of letters that can be included in this acronym. LGBTQ plus is the most common acronym you'll start to see today, and it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, questioning, can also stand for queer, and intersex. And then plus stands for all the other identities. It is considered an all-inclusive and all-encompassing terms to cover all of those identities that are not cisgender. Let's see, I have another definition here of pronouns. Pronouns are used in place of proper nouns, and they're used when you're referring to somebody instead of referring to them by name. So there's a pronouns chart that I included here for your reference. You might want to look some of these up. There are a lot more than these, but it's important to recognize that there are a number of different pronouns, not just he, she, and they. In the United States, also it's important to know that they is recognized in our dictionary as singular. So a lot of people struggle with they because they think they means more than one. That's actually no longer the case. In terms of understanding gender identity and gender expression, there's this cute diagram, and you can download it. You'll see it in the handout that breaks identity down. It looks at this stick figure, speaking of the head, which is intellectual, the heart, which is emotional, and the star, which is between the legs, and that is just gender identity, the sex assigned at birth. The other thing you'll see is this line on the outside, and that is how we show up. That is how we express ourselves. And we express ourselves in ways that tend to fall under the female or male gender norms. So a woman might wear a dress. A man might wear a suit and a tie. If you see it in the opposite, it gets confusing because a man in a dress is not what we expect as the gender norm for men. Or a woman in a suit and tie isn't what we expect in the gender norm for women. So how we dress and show up is an expression of our identity. Then you have what you have here in the, let me go back. You have The first one in your head is, how do you identify? How do you see yourself? That's called gender identity. The next one is, who are you attracted to? And this can be friendship attractions. It can be romantic attractions. It's not sexual attractions. It's all types of attraction. And so who and what other identities are you attracted to? And then the last one is the actual sex you were assigned at birth. Look at your birth certificate. Are you male or are you female? Your doctor looked at your gender and they assigned you one. They looked at your genitalia and they assigned you a gender. So this might be helpful to just understand all of those different terms around identity. All right, 2 questions. Can a person's gender identity change from time to time? Yes, that's actually called gender fluid. And how would one describe, what's QI? Questioning and intersex. I believe that was, there's questioning. Q can stand for questioning. Q can stand for queer. I stands for intersex. Great. Next question. What is a good term? So I get stuck on this one all the time. What is a good term to use to address a mixed group of friends in an informal email or text message? I have been using the term guys to be all-inclusive regardless of gender, but what would be a better term? I am guilty of saying, hey guys, whenever I'm in a group. And as a D&I person, I always feel like I need to then apologize for using guys. And then I flip to saying, hey, everyone, how do all of you feel? Or we, those kinds of things. And then I started questioning myself, because one of the concerns in the D&I space is that, are we getting too political? We're trying to be politically correct. And what about cancel culture? Is it creating this feeling that we can't say anything to anyone anytime for anything? And so technically, my answer here is, you want to use as gender generic term as you can. And then so instead of saying guys, say something like they. Then I also thought, guys, if we think about how the dictionary's definition of words, it's fluid and it can change. They, being singular now, is an example of that changing, understanding of language. Guys can also just mean a group of people. That's how I see it. That is not how a lot of people hear it. So the idea here is to really think about, how can you use language that does not isolate, marginalize, or exclude? So different way of thinking of inclusive language is to think about the language that doesn't create that sense of isolation and loneliness. Expresses discrimination, reinforces stereotypes. That's what we mean by inclusive language. Do you believe these topics should remain outside of the workforce? Different people have different religious views that could make this topic could insult. Wow, Donna, thank you. That is a fantastic question. And I think that the reality is, because we have so many different perspectives and views that are starting to show up in the workforce, our workforce is more diverse than ever before, as is our country. And we need to give each other the grace, the ability to navigate the language, the cultural norms and expectations, behavioral norms, to demonstrate that respect, to not ignore that those differences exist. Because when there was a session I did last June with Barrett, can't remember his last name, Young, and the title was "I Don't See Color." And in that session, we talked about that phrase. And one of the color, the "I don't see color" is well intentioned. What it's trying to say for most people is, I see you as a person and not as a race. But there are people who take it the opposite way. If you say you don't see color, then you're negating my ethnicity. So this falls into, they can't win, can't lose, can't lose for trying or win for trying. There's a phrase around that. And so to this point, I think bringing it into the workforce is about educating, creating cultural awareness so that we can see those differences and respect them. But we can also appreciate that we're not trying to offend, we're not trying to insult. And in trying to conversate, learn, know, network, meet, train, mentor, connect, we might offend. And so D&I training also gives us the skills to manage those moments. That's why we have so much around difficult conversations training. Is there an appropriate way to address someone that is general for all genders versus Mr., Mrs., Miss, etc.? Yeah, I just don't use those at all. You don't have to say Mrs. Myers. Oh gosh, why did I say that? My maiden name was Myers. Why did I say that? You could say, okay, so my first name is Jina, but when you see it in writing, it looks like Gina. So what would commonly hear is Gina Myers, and I knew they were talking about me. And I wasn't offended because they said my name wrong. I mean, how could they know? So I think when in doubt, use someone's name. That's the safest play. That's the safest way to go. A couple of things in here on the slides. You'll see there's some guidelines here for using inclusive language. I gave you some examples of what that might look like. And hopefully that will be helpful. The key here is you put the person before the thing. So the best example of that, let me look on this list, is, the very top one. Okay, actually, that's not the best example that I wanted to say. You don't say somebody is a blind man. You say that is a man who's visually impaired. And so that way, you're not defining the person as the disability. And it's the person who has a disability, but they're the person first. I don't think I explained that very well. And then it's just being thoughtful. Not worrying about going too far overboard. One of the last questions we're going to get to actually is a sensitivity around what's the right word to use. And I want to hopefully address that concern. So let me see, is there anything else in the Q&A? All right, so next question. Now, so these next questions came in through that open forum, that link that was in the registration. There were quite a few questions. And so I just pulled a few because I only have an hour. Don't even have an hour. But the first one was, whenever I hear diversity, it doesn't feel like it's diverse. It's only talking about race. And I get that. I actually hear that a lot in my work. And that's because a lot of the diversity work that sort of ramped up and organizations sort of moved forward on in a way that we've not seen before followed the murder of George Floyd. And as a result of that, if that was the impetus that started the conversations, it naturally started to feel like we were talking only about race. So this is something called the identity iceberg. I think Sasha referred to a version that she uses in her session, but she didn't share one. This is the version I created for my practice and my work. And that line between what's above and below the water is called the waterline of visibility. And the reason that this is really a helpful visual, at least I think it is because we can see that there are many diverse dimensions of diversity that we can see. They're above the waterline. You can see somebody's age, or at least how old you think they are. You can see somebody's race, or at least the race you think they are. You can see their gender. Again, you know where I'm going with this, or the gender that they're expressing anyway. Ethnicity, or what the ethnicity is that we think. We've probably all learned, and for those who've done a DNA test, a lot of that wasn't what you thought. It doesn't matter in that case. There's subtleties there, but they're also just visual things. But below the waterline of visibility are all these other dimensions that actually exist. And so to the question about when they hear the people talking about diversity, but it feels like it's mostly talking about race, this is a holistic view of diversity. And D&I work and work around culture and mindset and cultural awareness, interpersonal communications, all of that respects all of these differences. The challenge is we want to make sure that in our D&I work, we don't strip out the important work around providing, eliminating, discrimination, and offering the supports and the resources and the accommodations groups that have historically been marginalized need in order to be successful. It's really just about leveling the playing field. It's not about ignoring white men so much as it is acknowledging Latino women, for example. And you can do both, if you will. Someone asked, can you have a racial identity? For example, adoption across racial lines. Yes, there's no right or wrong way. And race in and of itself, so that is Scott. Scott, I would encourage you to reach out to me after. You have my email at the end of that's in my contact slide. Race is a complicated area in this country. The reality is racial identities and race itself is fluid. And for a lot of different reasons. One example very quickly, if you think about Latino and Hispanic, and people think they're interchangeable. Latino refers to people from Latin American countries. Hispanic refers to Spanish-speaking countries. So you can be both Hispanic and Latino, but you don't necessarily have to be Latino if you're Hispanic. And then you have a country like Brazil that is in Latin America, but they speak Portuguese. So are they Latino? I don't know. And what's this whole Latinx thing? When you start getting into that in terms of identities, is that just one example, hopefully illustrates that none of this is simple. And at the end of the day, your identity, how you identify, is something only you can say. I am biracial. And if you've been on this series before, I've talked about that. My mother's from the Philippines. My father is Black. I often feel like I have an agnostic racial identity because my experience was neither African American in the way so many of my Black friends had growing up, nor Filipino in the way that so many of my cousins and family and friends have had growing up. I'm neither, and yet I'm both. And so my racial identity is I jokingly say, as an other. But that's okay for me. That's what resonates for me. I joke about calling myself another, but I do feel that I have a different and unique racial identity. The next question is, what are microaggressions? Whew, I get that one a lot. Before I answer the question, I want to go to the polling question. Third polling question, which basically asks, has your organization offered training on microaggressions? So I see Christopher's opened the question, yes or no, has your organization offered training on microaggressions? I will let everyone know that when I'm working with clients and we ask about what other topics, or are there specific topics you would like training on, I have yet to sit with a client that did not ask about this. So I wanted to make sure we address this question in this session. All right. And so far, I can see the progress is mostly no's.
Mostly no's, indeed. This poll will remain open for another 20 seconds, folks. Get your selections in now, please.
Yes, answer these questions. You want your CPE. I'm a CPA, and I understand the importance of CPE. Actually, a lot of it.
I will close it in 3 seconds and show the results, Jina. When closing in 3, 2, and 1, and these are your results.
So only about a quarter have said they've done microaggression training. And so there is an opportunity for those of you who haven't had it. I would encourage you to go out on YouTube. There are some wonderful videos that you can do, that you can watch, that give you examples. And so what is a microaggression? It's an insensitive, often subtle remark that usually conveys hostility, reinforces a stereotype, or might otherwise marginalize a group. And usually it's unintended. Often it's subtle. And that's why it's called a microaggression. In some cases, they are intentional. And that is not a microaggression. That's an assault. It's called a micro assault. But so I found these pictures online. I'll just show you a couple of examples of them. So this one, the girl sitting next to me moves to sit closer to someone she's talking to, and then she whispers that she moved because she smells like rice. You look at this guy. I don't know what he is, so I say, what are you? Black woman. When people think it's weird that I listen to Carrie Underwood, Maybe this gentleman acts in a way that seems white, so they say, you're not really Asian. Or they look at this woman and think she's supposed to speak Spanish, and so if she doesn't, they're surprised by that. You don't act like a normal Black person, you know? Can I tell you how many times I've heard that one? And then this last one, can you see as much as white people? You know, because of your eyes. The thing about these comments is, in most cases, you can see how somebody might have said that intentionally. Without intending harm. Oftentimes it's out of curiosity. But it doesn't mean those comments are any less painful or hurtful, because it feels like you're being targeted, marginalized, isolated, dismissed, judged, shamed. I could go on. But that's what a microaggression is. And training is important to understand them, to be able to recognize them and understand how to address them. There's also something called bystander training, which is important for the person who observed it to understand how to get engaged, because that can be very awkward. And bystander training is not only important for microaggressions, but also when it comes to harassment in the workplace. All right, so this last question, which is the correct term, Black or African American? And that goes all the way back, I was saying earlier in the session, how I'll come back to this, sensitivity around language. There's no right answer. I get this question probably once a week, and the truth lies in the person that you're talking to. So for me, as I mentioned earlier, I'm biracial. And so I don't identify, or I don't feel comfortable with, or I don't refer to myself as African American. I refer to myself as Black. Now, my reasoning for that is I'm only half Black, but my skin tone, racially, I am Black. Ethnically, I am a blend, and African American to me doesn't feel like a race. Complicated. But that's what resonates for me. And so if somebody were to refer to me as African American, I'm not going to say anything. I do know that there are people who, if you say Black, they might get offended because they prefer African American and so on. So the challenge here is to not just understand that there's a difference, that the difference relies solely on what the other person thinks, but it's also practicing, and this is for all of us, practicing. If I say something and unintentionally insult somebody, how do I recover from that? How do I repair the insult so that we all can stay present and continue this dialogue, whatever we're in? Having coffee with colleagues at Starbucks, I say something and offend one person. How can I apologize, bridge an understanding, and then repair that moment so that we can stay present and continue our coffee? Somebody asked, is the term people of color correct? Yes. That is a statement of fact. There are people of color. Some would argue Caucasians are people of color because every human has a color. But the reason we use the term people of color is because we're generally referring to people who are not Caucasian. Somebody wrote here, microaggressions is a hot topic in their suburb in Dallas. Diversity training is dead here due to the culture wars. It's very sad. And I think, unfortunately, thank you for that comment. I think the challenge with diversity is that it's been positioned as a nasty thing. It's positioned as a shamey, blamey thing. In my work, I try to approach diversity more as an opportunity for us to learn more about each other. It shouldn't be just about race. It shouldn't be just about gender. It should be understanding the complexities of the human experience. Going back to that iceberg, there are a lot of differences. Race was only one of them on that iceberg. I have this last slide here just to talk about what I was mentioning, how race and ethnicity, as defined in the dictionary, is about people sharing a common culture or geographical background, descendants of a common ancestor. And if we all did that ancestry.com thing, regardless of the race we perceive we have, we would be shocked to find out how much commonality we have in our history, our family history. All right, so it is 5:53. It is 54 minutes after the hour, so we only have another moment Before I go to that fourth polling question, I don't even know why I put questions in here because it was Q&A the whole time. I had this one last question. Our work-based bookkeeping program struggles to find BIPOC intern candidates. BIPOC stands for Black Indigenous People of Color, in case you've seen that before. So struggling to find BIPOC intern candidates who see themselves in an accounting career. What might we do to overcome this? I wanted to make sure I asked this question. I should have put it in the deck because recruiting diversity is a common challenge. People don't know where to go to find candidates. And so one of the things I would suggest you do is reach out to different affinity groups, the ones that I mentioned. Look at colleges and universities, historically Black colleges and universities, and then also look at some of what's the word? I can only think of specialized recruiting boards. There's a term for that. It's escaping me. As ways to find more diverse talent. Last one, how come the D&I concept has been very common during the last 1 to 2 years, but not back in the last number of years? That is a fascinating question. All right, last one, I promise, last one. D&I work has been going on since the early 70s, late 60s. It's only starting to gain traction in the last 5 to 10 years, and then more generalized awareness in the last 2 post George Floyd. And I think that, so for those who were not aware of the work being done before, it seems like we're only talking about it now. But a lot of the reason we're seeing the diversity in the workplace that we're seeing today is because of those efforts that have been happening for decades now. All right, so as we wrap up, let's go do this last polling question.
Okay, folks, the last polling question is as follows. What was the most valuable part of today's webinar? A, learn something new. B, reminded me of something I already knew. C, curious and I'd like to learn more. D, CPE, or E, something else. Make your selections now.
It's too bad in the polling system you can't ask them to type in what the something else is. And can I just say, I love how many
questions
people,
panel.
Yeah, they could. I love how people check the CPE box as the most valuable thing that they learned. I appreciate the honesty. Some people have asked me, doesn't that bother you? And I'm like, no, this is intended to be free CPE. Hopefully somebody learned something, even if they came for the CPE.
Exactly. We hope so. I will close this poll down, folks, in 3, 2, and 1. And these are your results, Shana.
Yeah, you don't have to show those. The good news here is that over half said they learned something new. Yay. So this is a bi-weekly series every other Friday at 3 o'clock Eastern. Coming up on May 13th, I'll be talking with Jeff Phillips. He's the CEO at Padgett Business Services, but some of you may also know him as one of the founders of Accounting Fly, which is a recruiting platform, and Going Concern, which is related. He'll talk about that. He's joining us to talk about what he thinks might be a better value proposition as employers in an increasingly diverse workforce to hire and then retain diverse staff. So I hope you will join us. The registration page for that is now live and open. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you being here. If you have any questions, if you want to reach out with something that you didn't think to ask, here's my contact information. You're welcome to email me. And if you send me a LinkedIn invite, do me a favor and let me know how you found me, because we all know how you get lots of outreach, and sometimes it seems like people are trying to sell you. Thank you. And that concludes it. And so, Chris, I will hand it back to you to wrap us up.
Fantastic. Okay, folks, we're going to wrap things up for today's webinar. We here at CPA Academy will indeed process credit later on today, and it will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. You will also receive a full webinar evaluation form. Please fill that out, and it will be available in your account as well and come to you via email. Thanks again to our amazing presenter, Jina Etienne, and thank you all for your participation as well. We hope to see you in future webinars, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Chris, is it going to wrap up?